So I have the strange task of trying to weave together a conversation about plurality into some sort of overall frame. So this is what I'm going to try to talk about. There's some sort of difference between good and bad conflict. And I think a lot of us are sort of circling around these ideas, and they're very old ideas. So the first thing I want to try to get some agreement on is that conflict is not a failure condition. It's a normal thing. It's a inevitable outcome of people trying to work together in societies, because there's historical background, so we can never start from some sort of place where we're all square, because there's always things we can't anticipate when we make contracts and agreements with each other. I'm looking at you, Web3 voting schemes. And most fundamentally, because groups actually do want different things, and sometimes there is no way for everyone to get the same thing they want. And finally, because we don't want to eliminate conflict, because the only way we could actually do that is through force. So the first question I want to pose is, what makes conflict bad? There's a bunch of things we could say. So most of you are probably familiar with this type of graph. This is a graph of effective polarization in the US over the last few decades. And generally, what's happened is that we increasingly dislike the other. In the case of the American conflict, it's the other party, right? It's red versus blue. This starts to destroy the social fabric. So it used to be that people dated and married across political lines. They really don't anymore. This is from Teen Vogue a few months ago. You know, they're 10, but you know, they identify as a Republican, or alternatively, they say Black Lives Matter, right? This is 14% of Americans lost a friend over politics after the 2016 election. This is literally tearing us apart. Unfortunately, people in politics and media and related fields have an incentive to widen these divisions, because you can gain political power by pointing out how different they are from us and that they're a threat. It's kind of a devil's bargain. It can you know, propel you to victory at the polls, but it also widens the divisions and makes it harder to work together. And it's not just a question of how we feel about each other. We actually misperceive each other. So some of you are probably familiar with this idea of the perception gap. And basically, both sides, which I'm just going to call red and blue to avoid getting into arguments about what liberal and conservative really mean, both sides perceive the other as a lot more extreme than they actually are. It's symmetric. So what you're doing here is you're saying something like, you know, you ask Republicans how many Democrats would believe that most police are bad people, and they, you know, they estimate much higher than the true value. Right? So conflict can arise not just from sort of interpersonal or affective conditions or relational conditions, but also from objective misunderstandings of what the other side believes or what the condition of the world is. And that would be a bad kind of conflict. Ultimately, where this goes is, with increasing distrust, people switch from cooperative to coercive strategies, because they think that there's no other way to get what they want. And we all have kind of experienced this, or seen examples of this, or read about examples of this. The idea is that the moderates get marginalized, they get kicked out, there is a sort of uniformity or narrowing of opinion within each of the groups, which is, of course, the opposite of plurality. There's other work, which I'm not going to show today, that suggests that the more diverse the set of narratives in a society is, the more likely it is to be peaceful. So you want to watch for the narratives converging, and for social pressure to believe the same thing. Ultimately, what you get is an escalation cycle, which, if unchecked, heads to violence. People have mapped out the stages of this in pretty detailed ways. It starts by, you know, talking shit about the outgroup, but then, of course, they talk shit about us. And then inevitably, when something happens, right, there's some misunderstanding or even sort of an intentional insult or injury, we lack the social relationship to repair that. And so then, you know, people get angry about that, and then we expect them to do bad things, and then when they do bad things, we have, there's this beautiful phrase in the literature, confirmed negative expectations. It starts to be hard to back down because we've gone this far. There's social pressure to exclude the other. We maybe even be ashamed of the way we act around them, and to de-escalate would be admitting that we've done something wrong. Eventually, what we get is a situation where initially we want to do well, And then it becomes about winning, making sure that the other side doesn't get what they want. And eventually it just becomes about hurting the other side. At this point, you can start to get breakover into violence. People don't want to be violent. It's something they do as a last resort when they feel they have no other choice, most of the time. And ultimately, what this type of conflict does is it leads us to abandon our norms and our principles, right? When conflict escalates sufficiently, the basic considerations and dignity which we try to treat each other are abandoned because we are scared of losing, because there is some greater threat, because we feel we have no other choice. So that's bad conflict. What's good conflict? Right? I said it's inevitable. I said it's not always bad. So what makes it good? Well, democracy can be seen as a conflict mechanism or a conflict resolution mechanism. And sometimes you see statements like this. This was a losing presidential candidate in 1984. And he says, winning would be nice, but I'm glad we have this democracy and I accept the result. The basic premise of democracy is you should accept the result when you lose this time because you might win next time. That's an example of a good kind of conflict. But more fundamentally, conflict is often necessary to produce the conditions for positive social change. There's many people have discussed this. I'm going to cite a beautiful excerpt from a letter from a Birmingham jail from Martin Luther King. And he talks about this idea of creative tension. It's necessary to create some sort of confrontation, some sort of tension, some sort of discomfort to cause negotiations to happen, to set the conditions for a structural change in society or its relations. This has been developed into a political theory called agonistic democracy by a bunch of thinkers in about the last 30 years or so. And it says the fundamental feature of an agonistic democracy, there's sort of two ideas. One is that the other side really does want something different. It's not a problem we're going to solve by talking about it and coming to a consensus. So in that sense, it's sort of, I think it's more realistic because we don't always come to agreement because we actually do want different things sometimes. But it says we must treat the other side as adversaries, not enemies, and talks about how the conflict has to be constrained by some sort of norm. There's this beautiful phrase from agonistic democracy, a vibrant clash of passions, which kind of sums up this idea. The metaphor is you want to think of a sports competition or boxing and not a street fight is kind of the distinction we're trying to draw in this theory of democracy. And again, the idea is that we have to build a democratic system that can accommodate real difference that will not be papered over by deliberation. And what Mouffe is claiming here is that if we do not do this, then people will lose trust in democracy because they will not see a path forward to fundamental changes in the system. So she thinks that this is actually a radical form of democracy because it incorporates the idea that there can be real difference and radical changes. And interestingly, one of the things she says in this is that, for example, she doesn't agree with deplatforming or no platforming, because she says, well, that's not a real democracy if the people you disagree with most are simply excluded from the political sphere. That won't work because they will resurface in other ways. There's a bunch of literature which carries through these ideas. This is a nice example from the planning literature. So if you're like trying to do urban planning or design an institution or something. And it sort of splits these three different approaches to democracy or to dealing with conflict, right? And sometimes these are called aggregative, deliberative, and agonistic. So aggregative is everyone votes and we pick the best answer. Deliberative is we try to come to some consensus. And agonistic is we're not going to agree, but we still have to have some channel for conflict. So putting this all together, what we have is this idea of conflict transformation, which is rather than trying to sort of paper over our divisions, we want to change the nature of the conflict so that it leads to some better outcome. Sometimes we talk about this as peace versus justice approaches, and here's an example actually from Lisa's paper, looking at racial justice in the United States. And there's this sort of tension between these people who do bridge building and the people who try to address structural reform. And we have to have a system that incorporates both of these aspects. We can't have peace without justice, everyone says that, but the reverse is also true. If we're fighting, that is not a just society. You see this also in certain things within the social justice community. They talk about transformative justice. We need to have justice that's something other than punishment. All right, so this is this fundamental idea of conflict transformation. This is from John Lederach, who worked in all of these societies, mostly in Latin America, where there was conflict, and sort of developed these ideas and tried to find ways to change the long-term nature and trajectory of the conflict. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'm just going to lead with this slide. This is, as many different theories and people who had ideas about what the difference between good and bad conflict is. And I submit to you that as we think about designing pluralistic institutions, one of the fundamental challenges we have to address is to ensure not that there is no conflict, but that there is good conflict. And I will end with the slide. All right, thanks. Okay, I think one or two questions. Yeah, so the question, if I understand you right, seems to be about sort of when would you look at different models, this sort of aggregative versus deliberative versus agonistic. So I hope that how this works is that you have a sort of aggregative, it's a straightforward poll type of thing for sort of the routine problems. You have a deliberative process for when things get a little more complicated. You're not sure you're going to surface all the opinions without that. And then but then you have capacity for an agonistic approach when you discover that there is real difference. And ultimately, one side is going to lose out. Part of the agonistic idea is to open space for that sort of radical critique. And someone in the back of the room shouting about how fucking racist everyone is, right? Like, we have to have some method to incorporate that voice, or you get riots because they have no other way to be heard. Awesome. Yeah. So the question was about how do we talk about the love of authoritarian leaders that we see in various contexts and countries, and how does that fit in this model? So I think one of the ways that people come to want a strongman is when they see no other way to address their concerns. And another thing that I see happening is, this is related, I see it as related to polarization dynamics in that if there is no way for those people to be heard, and a sort of proto-authoritarian leader is able to amplify the differences between us and them and say, they will never hear you, they are not interested in your concerns, then that empowers the leader, right? Which is why I keep coming back to this idea of, as an institutional design, you have to make space for the people who you disagree with, not only disagree with, but who actually have different political goals than you. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you so much.